Hmm. Aha. There we are. Okay, that took longer than usual. Yeah, but now we seem to be actually online. Usually it only takes 20 seconds, but that was more like a minute and 10 seconds. But now it looks like we're actually streaming on the various platforms. This is David Rovix, and you are tuned to Discussions with David, which is coming to you on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Kebu Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon, as well as my own Facebook, Twitter, VK, LinkedIn, Twitch, and YouTube accounts. And we are usually broadcasting at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. in London, 7 p.m. in Copenhagen, usually on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, although it varies. And today's Wednesday, December 2nd, 2020, and I have the great pleasure of having our first guest from Denmark on my broadcasts, actually, since I started doing this last April, which is somehow surprising. I don't know how that happened, that we haven't talked to anybody in Denmark until now, but this is Ponti, and Dee is in Copenhagen, and I've known Dee a long time, and Dee, you are involved with restorative justice practices and all sorts of other things, and I and perhaps other people watching, let's see, we're going to be actually open to people if they want to comment or ask questions. I'll be monitoring that feed of comments and questions that might be coming. And but you're in Denmark. I'm in the United States. Most of our viewers are in the United States, which is complete chaos, basically. I mean, it could be much more chaotic, I suppose. We've all seen dystopic movies like Mad Max and stuff, so we know how far things can sink. But but I mean, it's like Denmark has you guys are doing a lot better through this pandemic. I mean, it sounds like at the very beginning, the government just kind of like froze the economy and did all this very sensible things that we don't seem to be capable of doing over here. But I wonder if you could just like give, I don't know, I mean, as difficult as it may be to even imagine what it might be like here, if you could just give give an American audience a little picture of what it's been like in Denmark since last April, as if you can attempt such a thing.
Yes. Yes, I've been thinking a lot about this pandemic, how we actually can compare places, because then
right?
we're all and what's been going on in Denmark has been really, it's been just very structured, I would call it. So we get the prime minister coming and saying, we'll close everything, this is how it's going to happen, and everyone does it immediately from day after.
Wow.
And it's been like that somehow in one way or another, and immediately the businesses are told that they will be paid for keep sending people home. And so there's not been this desperation that I've heard from other places.
This doubt, this constant uncertainty about the economics, right? That's the thing that you don't have in Denmark. So the stress of the pandemic and the loneliness, the isolation, that's all probably been a big focus for people, but not so much the fear of eviction or something.
Exactly. And because like there were good structures put in place for the pandemic, but there's also other good structures in society already. So people have unemployment benefits, or like no one really gets nothing.
So you have not had
the isolation, but I also think there's been a, because the measures also haven't been so hard compared to other places. So there's also been a level of that people could breathe still, people could go out, to like got out of their homes, and even in the worst times, people are still seeing someone, and they're not completely isolated.
And that was, and the schools were open too, right? The schools stayed open?
No, some closed, or they had to do it online for a while.
For a while.
Yeah. And then, but then they opened soon enough, and then they just started to doing a lot outside, or smaller classes, or the classes could only play with each other, or different ways to bring
Here,
people back.
people are often talking here, and I guess also in the UK, about how the pandemic has exposed the inequalities in society and made everything so much more stark. But that's not the discussion in Denmark, is it? Like, I mean, it's not like, I mean, everybody knows there are inequalities in Danish society, but has the pandemic like starkly exposed them? Or it's more like been like the government has dealt with the problem and has not, it hasn't resulted in that kind of more
Right.
falling
It didn't
apart of.
increase the inequalities of people. Yeah, I think
It
that
did not?
it did not increase. I mean, it's at least not
Right.
a discussion that's going on strongly. Now it's more discussions about, it's been discussions about, of course, how much power should the government had and what kind of laws should they have that could go into people's freedoms. Of course, people against masks or things like that. But or then the mink case, I don't know if it got there, but all of
The
the
mink
minks.
case, that's been global news, yeah. And the prime minister crying also made BBC headlines, which I don't know why that has to be a headline. Oh, did a politician shed a tear or something? It seems like a very reasonable thing to do, actually, and every day, in fact. But yeah,
A human act.
yeah.
Yeah, so in a sense, so compared to like the people I've spoken to, my friends in different countries, I'm myself Portuguese originally, friends living in Italy, in the States, in
And
Brazil.
have you been, I was going to ask about, you're also probably in touch a lot with folks in Portugal, and I don't know if your mother's from India. I don't know if you're in touch with folks in India or any other
Yeah, well,
parts of the
I'm not
world.
directly through my family, but I am in touch with some people in India. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But yeah, and then South America, also Brazil specifically, and
And
Italy.
Brazil and India, it's been just horrible. And how about Portugal? I haven't
Yeah,
heard anything
Portugal's
about Portugal.
been in between. I
Uh-huh.
mean, it's not been the horrible case of the US, but it's very far from Denmark. I mean, they've been really much more constricted, and people and the whole. Maybe the biggest difference is the attitude. Is that there's friction every day about, are we going to do this? Are we not going to do this? And it doesn't matter. And while here there are frictions, but there's a kind of a pretty big consensus on trying to do what we're told to do.
Mm-hmm. How about in Christiania? You live in Christiania, which for anybody who doesn't know is a 900 person or so, more or less, intentional community, basically in the center of Copenhagen, which was originally started as a sort of a anti-war protest / squatting event / something. It was part of the movement in 1970 when it first started as a community, and it's been there basically ever since, although it's often been threatened in many different forms. But what's it been like in Christiania during the pandemic? I mean, normally the summer in Christiania is just a massive constant festival, and that's presumably not been the case.
That's right. We actually closed Christiania.
Oh,
So
wow.
Christiania also lives today still in this big balance between what the authorities want us to do and what we ourselves want to do. And in this case, again, there were threats to close it, so we did it ourselves. And then
Right.
so a lot of actually of the harder part of the pandemic we spent on having shifts to not let people come in, but that meant we hanged out with each other and had soup and had meetings outside and discussed things and kept doing our political processes.
And what did that look like in practical reality? I mean, I think that right there is just, just starting to even, get into the subject of restorative justice and just any kind of justice. I mean, there's just, I mean, just to paint that picture, like this is a large patch of land in the middle of a, significant size city, and without the help of police, you guys are keeping people out of the territory, basically for health and safety reasons. How did that go? How did that actual process go? Like,
So
did people just leave when they were told it's closed?
Yeah, so we closed the entrances, the main entrances, and they asked, and they had shifts of 2 people I think almost just 4 hours in the night there was no one, but otherwise like through the whole day. And then we told people, no, don't come, and we're closed because of these reasons, and da, 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 da. And then and then once in a while, if they had a good reason or if there was something that they really needed to, and then I think some people dealt with that differently when they had that shift. But always kind of assuming the best in everyone, and that what they're doing is because they need to do, and it went fine.
Yeah. I mean, there's been so much discussion over here in the course of the movement that's been going on since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis around the whole question of policing and how to sort of what is the role, if any, of police in society, and how do we run a society, in practical terms without police? And I mean, and this is stuff that I think in very, very practical terms, you and other folks at Christiania have had to deal with on a daily basis for years. And it's a fascinating subject. And I think it's ever more fascinating because of your actual hands-on practical experience with this. And I mean, I think for most people, this is completely theoretical,
Yeah. And these moments when we meet and we and things have happened and there's been violence, so there's been that, but we know that it's up to us to make things happen. Like they're very different choices than if we could outsource them to someone to do more violence. It's
right.
Like, okay, we don't want maybe this person to come anymore because it's really been too much and we need to protect ourselves. And unfortunately, because we cannot, usually actually that never happens before some people at least consider the option of, oh, could there be a group that could be closer to this person, and could this person be helped in one way or another? So that's already a huge thing of restorative processes, we could call them. The idea that there's reasons why people did things as they did, and maybe lack of support is the major reason on why they acted as they did. And so very often I'll come to the extreme case soon, but very often we have people suggesting, oh, but maybe if you worked at our gardener group, then maybe that would support you in getting into a better path and like helping with this and that. And many times there's parents at the meeting, or children, or best friends. So there's people who know them in very deep, that know each other, that just know each other from. People in Christiania know each other really well because we're really not just neighbors. We are colleagues at work, and then we have been on different sides on a political matter, and then we're on the same side on the next one, and then our boyfriend married the girlfriend of the and then it all gets into like one big tribe or family, and we have each other to figure things out. So one of the things we've seen that works, like in the more extreme cases where police really would be called, like, I mean, and there's many cases where police would be called, which we don't do usually. But it's like, if we really want someone to be out, then what we've seen that really works is to be many people, not using violence, but then calling, if someone, we've asked them to be for 3 months out and they don't want, because they have some power struggle being part of a gang, or it's usually because there's drug dealers here. Then we call each other, and then we meet up and say, you have to go now, you have to go now. And even the biggest, someone who's really angry and like really threatening, but if you have 30 people like walking you out, sooner or later, you get that picture. So that's one of my answers to how to do without the police. We have to be together doing it. Sometimes we do need to do policing jobs. We just do it together, and together we protect each other.
And also this idea of having old friends at the meetings and looking to see how people can be helped. And I mean, one thing when I hear you describe it, it sounds like, first of all, a lot of work, a lot of time. Also, to some extent, it sounds very like, I mean, to me, from my vantage point, it sounds very Danish, some of that, like talking about their best friends and the kids they grew up with, and this emphasis on family and on sort of taking these proactive steps, which are much more sort of time consuming and in some contexts maybe more expensive, and then compared to just like punishment, which seems quick and easy, but it's not quick or easy. And but that's
and punishment ends up being very expensive on the other side also, like that it continues, then that's not serving us at all. Right. But it's very demanding. I mean, more than expensive, if we count people hours, it is a lot of people doing a lot of work. Just the big meetings are maybe 60 to 80 people for 3 hours, and if there's a big case, we can have them for 2-3 times. Like just that is a huge dedication, and it's people's emotions, and they then talk to their neighbors before and after, and how is that, and it's the dinner table, and then it's the next meeting, and that gets rounded off, but it's that dedication to each other. I think we also, why not give it to each other?
Yeah, right. But then it becomes such a commitment. But then some of the stuff that you guys you've been involved with dealing with in Christiania and at Folketshus, another sort of a originally squatted building in the Nørrebro neighborhood of Copenhagen. I mean, some of the stuff you've had to deal with when it comes to restorative justice and just trying to negotiate with the various elements involved with these kinds of communities, as well as with the police and the wider society. I mean, some of the stuff is, maybe it's like I imagine it's easier to talk about and to work out the less dramatic situations, but then there are some of them that's really quite about as dramatic as it can get. I mean, there's been a sort of ongoing simmering gang conflict involving sort of the drug trade that inevitably seems to always, to some extent, involve people on Pusher Street in Christiania, and that whole dynamic is just it's fascinating. It's complicated. I mean, you guys on Christiania, you operate by consensus, right? There's a so then the folks that have run what has been, I think, the longest standing open air market for cannabis in Europe, and it's been there since 1970 or thereabouts. This has been, you've managed to more or less basically keep hard drugs out of Christiania, but there's a cannabis market, and then this has involved or somehow led to gang conflict, or it seems to also involve questions around refugees and immigration and who are the different elements involved with the different gangs. There's a lot of racial overtones. It's very complicated, very modern, and it's like all the problems that you think of it when it comes to like modern urban reality in Europe, and then. And of course, police do come into Christiania on a regular basis, but like generally unwanted. But I wonder if you can just, I mean, I know it's way too much to even try to introduce. I've just been trying to introduce it, so you wouldn't have to do the basics, but with that introduction, can you keep on going with that and talk about the dynamics there?
Yeah. And I can also say that, like I also don't want to paint a picture that we're great, because we're also suffering everything that we can't do, everything that we don't manage to.
It's a constant struggle,
dynamics
right?
Are so strong and they're so big. There's so many things at stake of money and power that it's very difficult to figure it out and find real balances. And one process we feel to lose, and then another process we seem to have made a little movement. But what seems to work is that these people, the people who are selling cannabis, they live here, many of them, and so they're also our neighbors, and we talk about these things together, and they have a part in the processes and in anything actually. I mean, what's we've been seeing is that anything, and there is a play of power. We also, many people want them to be maybe less violent, or really stick to not selling hard drugs, or these kinds of things. But then they also negotiate internally, how much will they play with, or how much are they themselves wanting to go with it or not. And so for example, a year we met every week, a group of people called the dialogue group, where people who were selling cannabis were there, and people who were not selling cannabis were there. All of them just people from Christiania. And these meetings were very tense. I mean, most meetings in Christiania are very tense. That's the other part. We use a lot of energy. It's very hard. But they're very tense. But I think looking back, I see something happening. I see some democratic things happening, not democratic in any way that we usually use in the general sense, but in the sense of dedication, of participation, of getting everyone heard, of having some structures to how that should be, having someone to guide the meeting, having someone to make an agenda, some basic things that kept us continuing talking, because we don't have anything else. I mean, there's nothing else than going closer to the conflict and talking about things.
And yeah, so then, but and I mean, without saying that it's been it's glowing and complete success. I mean, there's been scary things that have happened with the gang conflict and everything else. But then on the positive side, basically, without the police being the ones controlling the situation, you guys have successfully kept hard drugs out of Christiania, and that's quite something. I mean, people often outside of Christiania in Denmark seem to think there's this lawless kind of atmosphere in a way, and they just can't imagine that it has been a successful effort to keep hard drugs out, and in their minds there must be all sorts of things going on there that aren't actually happening, but if they, if people go there, of course lots of people do go there and have a much more positive impression of the place, but I
think Christiania is really, really hard to understand from the outside, and the least you spend time here, the more difficult, the more impenetrable it is. Because a lot of what happens is not written, it's not public, it's relations, and the way, and there's a lot going on that's very difficult to understand. But there is, for example, we have this very clear campaign now about no hard drugs, but then we have to do it every few years about maybe against cocaine, and then we've tested each other. Like, okay, then if you're really not taking it, then you can just as well be tested, right? And then they do so, and they keep checks and balances against each other. So there's also some honor, like maybe attached to it. It's like we have these principles, and it's honorable to live by them.
That's interesting. Or if having principles, and then it's honorable to live by them, and that may be an important element of keeping things the way they are, because people internalize those principles, and it's just like, okay, this is how you do things. Like, you don't take pictures on Pusher Street. Like, it just becomes a sort of a norm.
Yeah, it just becomes some agreements that we have with each other, actually. And then there's some places to negotiate in between, but there's plenty. Like, no one's doubting if or very few people really fight against having this market, this cannabis market from the inside of Christiania. What we really want is to be legalized. What I really want is for the market to be violence-free. That's what matters for me. It's like, can we just do this without beating each other up? Can we do that? And many times we can. I mean, it's actually surprising how little happens for the dimension of this market compared to how it would look like in really lawless or parks and dark places and all kinds of other places, or other powers are in place. So there's a way where we keep each other, take care of each other, actually.
Right. Can you talk about, I don't know, have you noticed a particular relationship between like the refugee crisis from 2015 and a conflict around the drug trade in Christiania? Because I mean, my own observation as a just regular visitor in Copenhagen, as well as a regular consumer of cannabis, is that there is a basic racial divide between different neighborhoods in terms of who's selling cannabis in that neighborhood, and I wonder if you just any thoughts you have on that subject. It's also another subject that I think has a lot of relevance over here.
Yeah, I think there's been a change in the market here. I think it's become less white, which makes it actually more inclusive and other people having access to that. It's still very white, and it's still very sometimes also right-wing hardcore people. But what I've seen is more these like. But I don't really know how that has happened, actually.
It's a fascinating phenomenon, though. But it's it's also I mean, there's I guess it's also having to do with broader Scandinavian-wide kind of like gang affiliation issues there, as and maybe global gang affiliation, because we're talking about, in some cases, we're talking about gangs that originated in California, right? Whether we name them or not. So, you know, here in the United States, in Seattle specifically, there was after weeks of protests following the killing of George Floyd, eventually the police retreated from the Capitol Hill neighborhood and allowed the people to take over a 6-block area, which became known as the Capitol Hill occupied what did the P stand for? Precinct, I guess. It was a police station. It included a police station, and there were 2 murders that happened, and of course over the course of the next few weeks, and naturally, you know, certain press reports were apt to blame the lawless atmosphere rather than the fact that you had actual right-wing fanatics coming to visit the place with guns and looking to kill somebody, which is, you know, but this whole situation just gave rise to so much discussion around the question of autonomy and trying to control a neighborhood without the police, and what happens when the police get driven out. We spend in the United States, and at the average city, this is stuff I didn't even realize how bad it was until recently, but the average city in this country, half of our budget in each city goes to the police. Do you have any idea if that what the budget is for the police there? Because I mean, in Denmark, one thing is very notable about Denmark, especially outside of Copenhagen, is you hardly ever see a cop. You know, you just hardly ever do. I mean, of course, when you do, they're in large numbers and they're in riot gear. You know, it's very notable. You know, at least in my own experience. But in day-to-day life, there's just very little of a police presence, and there's a lot of social workers and a lot of pedagogues and a lot of medical staff, and I don't know if this isn't.
I don't know about the budget, but I mean, I'm sure it's not half of the budget. It can't possibly be. But I think that's also, I mean, I think partially, of course, that there's many other workers that do a lot of work about taking care of each other. Like social workers, like medical people, and that makes a huge difference, because then it's not the police that has to do all of that. But also, I thought something. I lost my.
I do that all the time. But like when people call the police, like if there's an emergency in Denmark and people call,
it's just general safety. Safety in Denmark, which is a result of wealth, of a high standard of living. I mean, this is one of the first things I noticed, like in my skin when I came to Denmark, was how safe I was at night. How free I am to do whatever I want, whenever I want, of walking in a place or walking in another place. Place with drug addicts, place Christian. Like it's not a dangerous place where things happen out of nowhere, but it's also because people have access to resources. They have access to food and shelter. They don't depend on taking it from each other or finding other ways of doing it.
And you had lived in the United States and in Portugal, and so you had quite a few other places to contrast it to by the time you were in Denmark, feeling so safe. Yeah,
very different. Like it's a whole tone in my body that went one tone down. It's like I can exist here, and it's part of the reason I've moved here. And it's not just the policing; it's also about gender. It's also about all kinds of things. But the whole fight that's going on in between people, it's just very different. It's happening at a whole other level.
It feels like such a different place as soon as, I mean, at least from especially coming from here, where it's like, you just relax in comparison. Like, it's like, you don't feel that stress of so much need and poverty and desperation and hustle, everybody hustling to survive. There's not that kind of same hustle. You realize that everybody's working so hard here, not because they want to. If they didn't have to be working all the time, it would be more like Denmark, where people just work reasonable amounts and relax a lot,
and go home early, and like have much more balance between what they're doing and what they need to do. Like it's a whole other.
But at the same time, I mean, having grown up in Portugal, I mean, it's such a contrast in terms of, I mean, I've heard many people from more sort of Mediterranean cultures talk about how everything shuts down in Denmark and Sweden at 5 in the evening, and where does everybody go? And there's no nightlife to speak of, and it's very cold and dark, and they say people are unfriendly. But did you have those experiences culturally at some point, or was not really so much?
I think I just understood pretty early that things were happening in other places. In the winter, for example, we go to the sauna, and then it's that kind of social space that we can have, or that people go a lot more to each other's homes. Or I don't drink, for example, so that's been also really easier to be here than it has been to be in Portugal, where so much is about eating out and starting at 9 and then being finished by 11 or 12 and then going for a drink and then sleeping late. It's like so much harder to exist for me. So I haven't had those struggles, but then I've had other struggles, like I'm very physical or very warm, and I find it very hard that people don't hug as much, or I can punch someone friendly, and that's like a huge deal, instead of just all that I did with my brothers all my life. Like it's not even a question. There's a whole much more sort of much more like immediate expression of feelings that I feel constrained by often here. And this is a little bit back to why I end up living in Christiania culturally.
Right.
There's other reasons, but culturally is because Christiania is from the south, is much more wild and free. And I actually don't know if I would strive in Denmark for a long time.
If you thrive in general, right?
Especially out of Copenhagen, I don't think I would. I mean, I don't think I would.
I mean, Christiania is also such an international community too. I mean, I guess it's probably mostly Danes, right? But there's a lot of people from all over the place living there, and certainly visiting.
But again, like this cultural thing is not just about where people are from. It's like the diversity that's going on just below my window, of characters, of life expression, of people that speak softly and people that scream every day, and people that are alcoholic and people that do completely, like it's so.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that. I really like to be in a place where there's space to be who you are.
And it's hard to imagine what Denmark might have been like before Christiania, because it seems like such an integral part of the place. But and also just what Denmark might have been like before the 60s, before all these cultural shifts. Because I mean, when I think of Denmark, and I think if anybody knows anything about Denmark, most people will think of things like really good parenting and social democracy and people looking after each other but the and I guess social democracy goes way back, but the whole emphasis on really good parenting, I think is only a couple generations. I'm not sure how, maybe more, but I mean, I don't have all the. I think
I don't know, but but the 60s and 70s did make a huge dent in this place, and the Christiania is just a very big icon of that. But
yeah,
the people really freed themselves in many deep ways. But I also think there's been some values that are Danish all the way through. There's been some, the unions, the work that the unions have been doing for 150 years, which has, which just like changes deeply the construction of a society when people are solidarious with each other. And so that's like been there as a base to build the niceness upon, or something like that. And it continues to be a huge element of how this society works.
80% of Danish workers are in a labor union. I think it's what is it here now? 7% or something. Yeah.
Yeah, but this also has been one of the things I culturally had to really learn what does, like, it's so different than what I've understood from unions from before, because it's just such a power and like a pride and a presence that is very beautiful to see what that has done to the working class.
Isn't it? Because the unions are always they're always on the table. They're always part of the discussion. They're really powerfully involved with everything, and not just.
And part of this, like what you were saying, also cannot think of Christiania without being Danish with all this conversation. It's because I think democracy is just very strong in Denmark. There's all the associations going on, very active participation of people, and things like the unions and all of that. It's just like very deeply ingrained, our political system, with a lot of parties and the dialogue seeking, like all of that is already very present. And I think that's also why Christiania survived, is because it has a lot of Danes. Because I think it's because in a way it's still conservative and still goes for dialogue and goes for, okay, let's keep let's do like this, let's not be too wild. While I think in other places the wilderness would have taken over, and then it would have imploded.
And then the outside society, being Danish, probably also, as much as there's been opposition to Christiania over the decades, the fact that social democrats have generally been in power has been very positive for Christiania's continued existence, I would say.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's really been it's been opposition, but it's really been a lot of collaboration.
Dee, did you have a lot of plans for the spring or summer that were derailed by the pandemic arriving?
A few. I was supposed to go to restorative justice conference in Italy, which was cancelled.
Can you talk about that? What's the discussion like? Have you been to many other international restorative justice conferences?
No, it's something new that I'm a bit interested in doing, is because the work I do is very community-based here, and I've really chosen to stand by the communities and Christiania and Folkets Hus and some others, NGOs, very much from the periphery of society. But I'm also starting to be curious to how to bring that to a more mainstream audience, but of people who I agree with value-wise, like the restorative justice practitioners. So that was going to be my offering, to tell about these communities in a poetic form, so that I could hold my own space on telling about. So I'm looking forward to go again, and I'm also following them now and having a little bit. But it's difficult because restorative justice is a very broad field. The line I follow it's called restorative circles and comes from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. But it's like one subgroup which is more community-based, because a lot of it has also been co-opted by the police. For example, in Denmark, there is a control which is made by it's an offering of the police for the victim and the perpetrator to meet.
And it's not good. It's not well done.
I mean, because I'm an idealist, it's not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with the whole idea of victim and perpetrator. I mean, many times there's much more happening for us to define exactly who did what and who's the wrong person to start with. And then it's really not including the community, that's where we see the difference. Like who participates, not, like who's impacted by what happened, and who also can make a difference for what can happen from here. It becomes so institutionalized and raw, like cold. I wouldn't go for it, even if I.
That isn't. I mean, how much of that aspect of involving the community is kind of a problem, particularly in social democracies like Denmark? I mean, it's like, from one of the things I've noticed, and I don't know how this plays in with your life or work around this, but one of the things I've noticed is that, like, the most solidarity I've ever seen in a neighborhood in terms of community and people helping each other was when I lived in a neighborhood in Olympia, Washington, where most of the people were women or mothers of small children on welfare and dealing drugs. And the community solidarity was amazing, and nothing like I maybe had been led to believe by mythology. I figured there'd be a lot more infighting and stuff than, I mean, there was hardly any of that. But then at the same time, in Scandinavia, in Germany, I find people are much more apt to just, like, you got a problem, call the relevant government office and they'll deal with it. And on the one hand, that's wonderful, and that's great that there are states that are so well organized and have all these services. But the idea that anybody would ask their neighbor to babysit for a couple hours is like, what planet are you on? This is Denmark. Call the government; they'll babysit for you. That's almost like,
No, but I don't know. This is the backside of this too organized from the top down. It's that you can always call a service, and then you're always not engaging yourself in the solution either. It's also always about, and we know that all of these structures that are in place, they're also a bit random. When do you make the cut to get this benefit or the other benefit? It's not that human. And that's why I seek places like this, and that's also why the other community members do, is because it empties some of our humanity also. This thing that the government just does everything and everything's equal for everyone, no matter what, and also simplifies people's lives in ways that I don't think is nourishing, because it becomes more about family also. Then there's some other conservative things that come out of that. Then you have your family, you go to these associations, you have your job, and that's your life. And life, that's the least about life. Life is so much more rich and complex than that, and there's so many relations we can have that are not defined on those categories.
And then there's also a factor that comes into play in social democracies, it seems like, where sometimes if there's some good thing that you could be doing involving restorative justice, for example, you can, if you're good at applying, filling out forms and stuff like that, you can probably find a salary from the government and get paid to do this stuff, and then that changes the whole thing, doesn't it? And that's.
I mean, I think this is a huge problem. Is we see, for example, with restorative justice, I've just told you that there's the police has it, but then it's co-opted somehow, and there's no community-based services. I mean, there's a little bit, and we have a little group that does stuff pretty much volunteer, but it's very much also because if we start getting a lot of money, or like institutional money, then we start having to report in all kinds of ways, which I wouldn't be safe doing, or I don't want to abide by some rules that tells me that I have to tell the state what someone just told me in confidence. I mean, I'm just not going to call the police. Like, I just refuse to do that.
Right.
And so when I've tried to do this, I was working at a homeless shelter, and I tried to implement some restorative justice there, or some circles or dialogue groups. But the structures are so strong, and the punishment is so thorough. It's like, you just call the police, and it's just like, and this whole professionalization, like, it's just your job, don't take it home, don't meet with these people. It's dehumanizing. I mean, so maybe state is better here, but it's still crap.
Yeah. When you were in, can I ask about Folkets Hus? Because this is I think a really interesting and different kind of situation than Christiania. It's a very much a contrasting. I mean, because Folkets Hus is just one building in the middle of an urban neighborhood, very different from Christiania. Like, it's not a community in that sense. And it's a long-standing community center in Norbro, and for all sorts of outdoor festivals and indoor events of all kinds. But it's also been had a big problem with being swept up in the whole sort of drug trade and gang violence in Copenhagen. And can you talk about your involvement with trying to get that place back onto some kind of a good even keel?
Yes, it's a fascinating. It's a community center, as you're saying, and it's really has this hope, and I would say quite much the practice of being a space for very different kinds of people. And again, this is one of the things that drives me, diversity. So that's why I like to be there too. But that's also where conflict happens, in fighting. There's been also the thing with the gangs, because it's also a place where there's a lot of youth that are unemployed and don't know what else to do. But then there's also this, and this is the part I could speak a lot about, but I won't, is that there's also been the left has also started creating with the lawyer and some people that are influential, people who were who are now in their 50s or 60s, and then they want to protect these spaces. And they do sometimes a good job, like Christiania itself also is owned by ourselves, but they also in many ways do a service to the municipality or to those that want to keep control. So that's been like a way to keep a little bit the gang fights a little bit out. But we're still having, not at the level of gangs, fortunately, in Folkets Hus, but we have quite a bit of a diversity of groups, and I think this is happening a lot in the States about how to coexist, how to even speak the same language, like queer people, young queer people, or old Marxists, or people that are on benefits, and so everything is already difficult in their lives, and sort of class. Then you get the academics very well spoken against racism, but then others don't even understand they're doing racist acts, and so we have all of that happening and trying to hold. But there is one thing going on there that I also think is quite Danish, unfortunately, like especially compared to Germany or something, where activism seems to have an age, seems to be like between 20 and 30, or at least is like at the time you're studying and you have time for that, and before you get the kids and all of that, or only the very hardcore, very committed ones stay in later stages of life. And that I find very sad, because I think the exchange between ages is just a wonderful contribution. I mean, it's really good to have different ages to create.
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, Denmark also has this history, which is somewhat, I think, I mean, I don't know if it's not unique, but it's pretty unusual in terms of like the children's power movement back in the 80s.
We have a group back at Folkets Hus. We have a new group of children power.
Wonderful. And this history of also of the House of Youth, Ungdomshuset, which is also like, I mean, basically there's no official cutoff date, but pretty much if you're over 30, you don't, you know that it's you know, you need to move on and do something else.
No, and Folkets Hus has a bit this element of, you know, you have that group of the children's power. We have Black Lives Matter at Folkets Hus. We have these different queer groups. A lot of people working with racial justice and also BIPOC communities that are starting to be more part of the Danish activist scene. And then we also have this and the whole movement of the people who squatted a lot in the 80s and 90s. There has been like this huge movement in Denmark. And they're also like where one can belong, a few of them belong there. And so
at Folkets Hus, right?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like if you've been involved with the youth squats, then that's the adult squat where you can still
still hang out and still read some things together and make a film screening and discuss a few things together, and no one's deciding. Yeah.
So, I know that among as you're doing things locally, you're obviously, I mean, you're talking about how you're keeping track of what's going on in various other places, Brazil, Portugal, and I know you're probably keeping track of a lot more beyond that. And I wonder what you have as you look at the whole global situation. I know, you know, to whatever extent you're able to take it all in. It's a big year for trying to take in the global situation. It's always a big year, but 2020 is a bigger year. But do you have any thoughts on where things are going in the next few months out there in the world or in Denmark?
I need to be an optimist. And Trump having lost is extremely important for my own understanding of the world. But the problem is that it's, of course, not enough. And people like Bolsonaro still in power. And like the destruction that has happened has been immense. So there's a huge need for healing. Like there's really, really, really need for just coming back and continuing the work where we actually hold ourselves in ways that we're not, just surviving and suffering and being discriminated all the time. I really hope the world learned a lesson in this last year, actually.
Do you think Brazil, I mean, do you get the impression like in the United States that years of having a fascist in power has really just done really lasting damage to the fabric of the society? I mean, because when people talk about healing, it feels like when we're talking about the United States or Brazil, it feels like, well, we got a gaping wound here. So, I mean, something else has got to happen before any healing is going to be, you know, we need some serious medical intervention before anything's going to start healing, you know?
No, exactly. Healing is not from this like privileged place of like, oh, now I can just sit down and not do nothing. It's the opposite. It's a very active. It has to be very active. I mean, we need to reconstruct some institutions and organize ourselves. And I mean, it has to be, it's like, it's screaming how much we need to do that, because it needs to stop. The damage needs to stop, and then we can heal. But it's not stopping because so much has been destroyed. So it's not stopping yet. That's my understanding of the impact. So it's not enough when these fascists get out of power, because then what they did still stays a lot in the mechanisms. You know, and as Portuguese, I didn't live through the revolution, but I think there's still elements of having had such a fascist in power in 74. No, in 74. So it's years of reconstruction.
Right.
Do you feel like people are like the mistrust on humans and what they can do is really hard to repair?
Yeah. When you're keeping track of what's going on in Brazil, do you get the impression that you're able to get a much better, a much more accurate impression of what's happening because you speak Portuguese?
Yes.
I mean, I feel like there's like a lot, you can read a lot about Brazil in English, but you know that you're only getting this little tiny.
No, but this is, it's, you know, it's like when I see an article in the US about Denmark, and then you see how they're like looking at this little tiny thing, and then there's
Awful.
a whole other world going on. And that's the feeling I also have when I see anything about Brazil in English. It's like little tiny, and it's so complex what's been going on in the political system there, like besides Bolsonaro, like the whole fighting in Lula and the whole and how the justice system also has been so mixed up on the political dirty, like really dirty stuff. It's there's so many elements that I think we're really missing it as a global discussion of what's going on there.
Because everything that's been happening in Brazil has basically been just as complicated as everything that's been happening in the United States. I mean, to put it one way, like it's a very similar and just as complex, or maybe more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, the structures in Brazil are also weaker or more young. So they're just really fragile and just like fall apart. Like in the US, at least as from here, and this is really like all of these impressions, but it's like it's crazy stuff happening, but there seems to be some stuff that still holds, you know, like there's some level where there's some things that work still, and
right.
Everything's like a mess collapsing.
Is it your impression that it was that Bolsonaro's rise to power had much to do with the Workers' Party mismanagement, or what would you say in terms of how that happened?
Yeah, it seems like I know a lot about it, but it's because my very good friend Christian, our partner, is studying Brazil and wrote a book about it.
That's helpful. I love knowing intellectuals. Yes.
But that's why I hear a lot about this stuff every day. Right. So I know I have some impression, but no, I don't think it was this mismatch. I think it was a plan almost, and part of bringing up the party, the PT's wrongdoings was part of a plan, because it really is like what they've been doing wrong is so little compared to what the other parties have been doing. Right. Of money and the way they've been using them personally, because at most what PT was doing was to like reuse it into the party, and it's just the scale of moral is like completely different, and so it's been, people have just been really, yeah. And then because it's judges that have been, I don't know, you've probably been reading The Intercept and what they've been doing. Mm-hmm. You know, but his story is like, because I also care for justice, and even the normal justice, some level of, but the idea that the judges and have been planning things and making agreements, I mean we cannot use the word justice in this. I mean it would be to rob it of any of its meaning. Right. So and I think it's like more of like a right-wing plan.
Right-wing plan backed by the settler elite, by the planters, by the big landowners, it seems.
Yeah. Mm. It couldn't do more of PT. Yeah.
Dee, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. I hope other people out there enjoyed it more. They weren't commenting much, but that's not uncommon. You know, people watch and then, yeah. You know, they know that I forget to look at the comments anyway. So
exactly. But thank you, David.
Thank you so much. I'll just do a little
as I understood, this is your plan to also keep sane during the pandemic, right?
Oh yeah, this was my sanity plan. Yep. This was my whole plan. To have adult conversation and with people other than my wife. Yeah, that's you know, definitely, because it just doesn't happen otherwise, you know, unless I'm with some intentionality, you know, because between a baby and a toddler, you just you can easily spend your whole day doing nothing but baby toddler. Yeah.
But they're very cute and sweet.
So they're very cute. Yeah. Take care, Dee. I'll see you soon.
Take care.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning into this discussion with Dee Ponti in Copenhagen, Denmark. You can see this discussion on restorative justice and other subjects archived on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics. or on various other platforms, including the video section of the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cebu Community Radio. And in podcast form, it'll be up shortly if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts. And I'll see you again here online soon. And remember, don't pay the rent, trust your neighbors, mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.